In Florida State Prison, the final 24 hours of death row inmate Kayle Barrington Bates began with silence. After more than 40 years of legal battles, appeals, and delays, Bates was facing the ultimate punishment for the 1982 murder of Janet Renee White, a crime that left Bay County shattered and her family waiting decades for justice. But in his final hours before execution by lethal injection in 2025, Bates made choices that shocked witnesses and prison officials alike. He turned down the traditional last meal, refused spiritual counsel, and when asked for his last words, he offered nothing but silence. His actions left the room heavy with unanswered questions. For Randy White, Janet's husband who had waited for decades for closure, this moment marked the end of a relentless pursuit of justice. But for everyone else watching, Bates' behavior in his last 24 hours left chilling doubts. Was it defiance, fear, or something more? This is the story of Kayle Barrington Bates, the Florida death row inmate executed after 4 decades, and the haunting details of his final day that still echo through Florida's history of the death penalty. Before we begin, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment your thoughts below. Your support helps us share more deeply researched true crime stories, from death row executions to the untold cases that define America's criminal justice system. On June 14, 1982, the city of Panama City in Bay County, Florida, was struck by a crime that would haunt the community for decades. Janet Renee White, a 24-year-old woman working at an insurance office, never came home that day. Witnesses recalled that she had been confronted at work by Kayle Barrington Bates, a man only a year older than her. Hours later, Janet's life was brutally cut short. Bates abducted her, attempted to sexually assault her, stabbed her multiple times, and stole her diamond engagement ring. When investigators arrived, they didn't have to look far. Bates was found at the scene, covered in blood, with Janet's stolen ring hidden in his pocket. Fibers from his clothing matched evidence from the victim, and a broken watch pin tied him further to the crime. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Bates confessed. By 1983, he was convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, armed robbery, and attempted sexual battery. For Janet's family, especially her young husband Randy White, the guilty verdict seemed to bring justice. But the reality was far more complicated, because this case was far from over. Instead, it marked the beginning of a 43-year legal battle that would test the patience and pain of an entire family. Justice, at least on paper, came quickly, but the years that followed dragged the case deep into legal limbo. In 1995, more than a decade after the crime, Bates was resentenced. His attorneys launched a series of appeals, challenging every angle of his conviction. They argued he suffered from organic brain damage, sought to block evidence, and even attempted to raise questions about the fairness of his trial. In later years, they filed a federal lawsuit claiming that Florida's process for issuing death warrants under Governor Ron DeSantis was discriminatory. But time and again, the court struck down these claims. While the legal system debated, Janet's family waited. For Randy White, her husband, every delay was another reminder of what had been stolen from him. He carried a silent vow, one he had made to Janet in the days after her death, that no matter how long it took, he would see her killer face justice. And then, in 2025, Florida's governor signed a piece of paper that would finally set the countdown in motion. In the summer of 2025, Governor Ron DeSantis signed the death warrant for Kayle Barrington Bates. This decision didn't just affect one case. It made history. Bates's execution will be the 10th carried out in Florida in 2025 alone, the highest number since the U.S. Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty in 1976. For Florida, it was a legal milestone. For the nation, it was another example of the state's aggressive use of capital punishment. And for Randy White, it was something much more personal. The wait was finally ending. After 43 years of appeals and delays, a date had been set. The nation's eyes turned once again to the Florida State Prison in Stark. Journalists gathered, officials prepared, and the prison drew its focus to one man who had lived half his life waiting for this moment. But what does the final day of life look like for a man who has spent more than 40 years waiting to die? On August 19, 2025, Kayle Barrington Bates woke up inside Florida State Prison at 5:15 a.m. This was the morning he had avoided for decades, but it had finally arrived. Prison records confirm he spent his last hours with his closest relatives, his daughter, his sister, and his brother-in-law. They were granted private visits, a final opportunity to speak with him before the state carried out the execution. Unlike many others on death row, Bates made few requests. He declined the traditional last meal, refusing to order the foods often seen in final headlines. He also refused the presence of a spiritual advisor, choosing not to seek comfort or prayer before his death. When officials asked if he wanted to make a final statement, a chance to leave last words on record, Bates said simply, "No." No apology, no explanation, no closure for Janet's family. After more than 40 years, the man who once confessed to her murder would leave the world in silence. But while Bates remained silent, one witness in that chamber carried a promise that had been kept alive for decades. Inside the witness chamber sat Randy White, Janet's husband. For over 4 decades, he had lived with the memory of his wife's murder and the haunting delays of justice. He had been a young man when Janet was taken from him, and in the years since, he carried a vow he made to her memory, that one day he would be there when justice was finally served. At 6 p.m., Bates was strapped to the gurney. Prison officials began the lethal injection process. Witnesses sat in silence as the chemicals flowed through his body. At 6:17 p.m., the warden announced the words Randy White had waited half a lifetime to hear. Kayle Barrington Bates was dead. For Randy, it wasn't victory. It wasn't joy. It was a fulfillment of a promise he had made decades earlier, a promise that had carried him through grief, frustration, and endless courtrooms. But the story of Bates's execution didn't just end with one man's death. It became part of a larger chapter in Florida's history. The execution of Kayle Barrington Bates was more than conclusion of a single case. It symbolized a turning point in Florida's history with the death penalty. His execution marked the 10th in the state in 2025, setting a new record and sparking national debates about capital punishment. But beyond the legal milestone, the execution left haunting images. Bates refused food, prayer, and words, choosing silence as his last act. For many, that silence was chilling. It left no apology for Janet's family, no explanation for his crime, and no attempt at closure. For Randy White, however, it marked the end of a promise. After 43 years, justice had finally been carried out. Yet, as Florida moves forward with record numbers of executions, one question lingers in the silence Bates left behind. How many more families are still waiting, decades later, for justice that feels just out of reach?